Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We on the side of the government want to ask the question, is it wise to have a holdover from a non-democratic era in a world which is increasingly pushing for democracy? We think that when we look at what's happening in the world specifically and what the context of European monarchies are, we think that the time has come and it would be wise for monarchs in Europe, as the resolution says, if they were an heir to a European throne, they should refuse to become a monarch. A little bit of explanation on the resolution I think is merited, but we think it's pretty straightforward. We are essentially saying that we pretend that we are a monarch trying to act in the interest of our people and for the world as a whole. And we think that if we are acting with this in mind, then we are going to refuse to accept the throne. All right? So in this speech, I'm going to be making three main points. First of all, I'm going to be talking about pragmatically how is this going to play out in the country. Secondly, how this is a symbol of moving forward from the past. Thirdly, about how this is going to be a message to the world. And then my partner Kyle is going to be talking about some more of the ramifications on a more principled and philosophical level. But first, let's talk about how this is going to likely play out. So in the context of the modern EU, we think that if a person is going to refuse the monarchy, the reason will be very clear that democracy is the preferred alternative. That they are saying, no, I don't want to take this throne because I think the rule should be in the hands of the people. In terms of social movements, we think that's clearly going to be what's going to happen. Now, we're going to get two scenarios out of this. Either A, this is going to result in dissolution of the monarchy, and we're going to say that that's fine, and we actually encourage that because we're going to increase the move towards democracy and rule of the people. But outcome B, which we also would say was fine, is that we're making a strong statement against monarchy for the purpose of democracy, all right? Because this is perceived as a strong distrust of the monarchical regime. Now let's get to why this is important with my second point, but your point.
Okay, you're putting us in a perspective of a Republican citizen of the Europe. But tell us why should we do this as a monarch from its perspective, for his perspective?
Well, we say that obviously if we're trying to be a monarch and you want absolute despotic control, then this wouldn't be the right action. But we say if you're trying to act in the best interest of the country, then this is clearly what you would want to do. That's what we're going to take this debate. That's where we think we can have the best debate, if it's in the interest of the country for the monarch to do this. All right. Now let's talk about how we're moving for clarification.
Yeah, please. Are you saying the debate in countries where there's only monarchy and there is no democratic parliament?
No, we're going to say any country, even if it already has democracy, we say that the monarch should not take the throne. Okay, so let's talk about why this is good, about how this is moving forward from the past. All right. Now, culturally speaking, monarchies are generally holdovers from an era where the will of the people was not considered the foundation for authority. If you go back 300 or 400 years, generally speaking, the treaties and the monarchs talk about divine right of kings, is that the feature and authority deriving that allowed a country to even have a government and have a rule came from usually God or something else, you know, the power of this person's family, but certainly not the will of the people. But things have changed since then. In nearly every major European country, the sentiment has clearly shifted, and people see that the rule of the people is superior. And we're going to argue that not only is this people's perception, but this is actually as it should be. And this is not just because I'm a citizen of the United States. We think that this would be good for everyone. First of all, we see that more people are happy because they're actually getting to vote on what they want and what they want to see in their country. Secondly, we see their needs more effectively vet because every so often politicians will get up and argue about, hey, what are the things in this country that need to be dealt with? Thirdly, we see that corruption is more easily solved because you have the media and things that are checking, not at this time, checking the members of government, and also just to check on abuse. Now, we say, you may say that, well, these aren't really problems so much in a lot of the countries that have directly elected parliaments. We say that this is still a symbolic move to the country, all right? Because we're going to say that for all cases of the government and for all parts of the government governing authority, the people are the source of an authority. And so this very much would be a symbolic move. Now, why is symbolism important? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, this is a tangible version of an intangible reality. So this monarch is saying to the people of the country, hey, this is not about me, this is not about my family. The purpose of the government is to serve you and make sure that your interests are met. All right. This will also embolden the people because it's showing them very clearly what the purpose of the government is. All right. This also will get it more in people's minds and more in people's conversation about how the actual authority and will of the people is the foundation for the government. I'll get the end of this point. And so we'll see that this will embolden the people to actually make sure and in the long run act in their interest and establish this principle as a precedent for the foundation of government. Your point.
In the Netherlands, there is a democratic regime.
Yeah, we say that even in cases where there is a democratic regime, we want to further concrete that and say that in a democratic regime, there is really no place for the authority of the state being vested in an individual that's not elected by the people, because it's outside the foundation. Now, the third major point I want to bring to you is about how this is going to send a message to the rest of the world, all right? Because much of the abuse happening on the part of governments around the world is in the spirit of monarchy. Single people at the heads of state that are trying to tyrannize their people and exploit them for his own gain. And they're often trying to mirror monarchs as much as possible. They do this like Saddam Hussein did, but building a palace for himself. They wear these imperial garbs. But essentially, they're ruling like kings, and very often there's a sort of succession, as we see in Syria with the Assad family. So basically, what we are saying here is that we as European monarchs see what's happening in the world and see so many people being killed and tyrannized by their own governments, by single men at the head of the state, and we say that this is not acceptable, and we are not accepting the throne because this form of government is not appropriate. It cannot be handled in an appropriate way, not by everyone else, but certainly not by us. We think it's really hypocritical to say to the rest of the world, hey, this form of tyranny is not okay, but we still have holdovers in Europe of single men at the heads of states. We think this is really hypocritical, and it undermines what we're trying to do. And so it's a symbolic move saying, not only are you can't be responsible with this, but we don't think anybody can be responsible for this. We think the true foundation of authority would be in the will of the people. So in the spirit of that, we urge you to vote for the proposition. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for that speech and invite Ford Alexander to open the case of the opposition.
Thank you for the floor, Madam Speaker. So what we find here highly problematic from our first government is that one of the first sentences from them we heard was the context of monarchy in Europe, but then all we heard about was the dictatorship. And that is highly problematic. I will explain that later in my rebuttal, but I just want to announce what I will be talking about. First off, the pressure towards the monarch, and the second thing, the traditions of that country. So, going back to rebuttal, it is the idea of the first government that monarchy in Europe is actually one man ruling over the whole country, being corrupted, mistreating his people, etc., etc. What actually is happening in Europe is that we have a democratic or institutions that function properly. So we still have some democratic notions in our monarchies, and we see something like that in UK. So when it comes to states like that and monarchies like that, the monarch as an institution in that country is more like a symbol of a tradition, more like a person who represents that country in its all past and glory of that whole state, and not the decision maker as they have brought it. No, thank you, later. So when it comes to their explanation of the dictatorship and all the pragmatical things that democracy is better than monarchy, etc., etc. Yes, we agree that the democracy is better than one man ruling over one country. Yes, the democracy and the rule of people is better than rule of one man. But this is not the rule of one man. We still have democratic institutions. We still have parliament. We still have governments. We still have all those people who function as a democracy. But because of the symbolism of the past and the traditions, it is still monarchy, and it still has monarchy. No, thank you. It still has monarch and a family around that monarch that represents that country. And furthermore, even if we say that it might go to their rule. Well, people would see it that way. People would see that they are losing the democratic, no thank you, that they are losing the democratic steps they have taken to reach this far, and they would do something about it. It is not like we're striving towards dictatorship of monarch in Europe. No, we're striving for democracy in Europe, and we are functioning as democratic states perfectly currently, and we are improving our democracy every day. But as monarchies remain, it is only a symbol of the past and symbol of representation of our country, which we believe it is quite important for us. And I will explain why in my arguments, but before I go, yes.
Would a reasonable monarch care about the fact that they're a cultural icon as one person, or would they be interested in the cultural icon of the entire country represented?
Thank you exactly for that question. I will talk about that during my argument about tradition. But first of all, the look through the eyes of the monarch, which we haven't heard from the first government. Now, monarch and his family are currently under the eye of the public, and they are constantly under pressure of the public because they need to behave in a sort of in a manner that suits the monarchy and the monarch, and they must act accordingly. If they do not, it is highly problematic for them, and they are under the pressure of people. But then we come to the question of resignation. Should they resign? People would pressure them even more, because the person that has been on the top of the state for so long, for like 50 or 60 years, because currently heirs become monarchs in their 40s, in 30s, or something like that. They have lived long enough on the top of the state, and people have had them under their eyes for a long time. When they come to the level of normal people, they will be far more pressured as to and the questions will be raised how they live now, what new gossips are there. So more pressure will be put towards them, and that is highly problematic for an individual, no matter which individual it is. So it makes his life harder. Second thing, he's been trained all his life for this. When he goes to living like all the other people, he won't be able to fit in properly, because that is not the way he lived, and that is not those are not the functions he did. He was prepared to all his life. Coming to my second argument, it is the traditions. States like United Kingdom and other monarchies like their traditions, and they honor them very much. It is the idea, no thank you, that they cherish those traditions to such extent that we currently, even today, can hear the sentence, "God save the Queen" in UK. Why is that? Because they love their monarch. They love the idea of having that traditional value, the traditional figure, no thank you, the traditional figure on the top of their state. It is important for the people to be recognized as a monarchy of United Kingdom. Why? Because it is the relic of a past, and it is something that that defines them, that defines the whole state, it defines the society, it defines whole people who live there. And when we come to the moment, no thank you, when we come to the moment that it is the and to the point of that was brought by the second government about culture of the whole state. This is the culture of the whole state. This is not the culture of one man. It is not one man's. It is not one man's will to be monarch to be symbolized as a monarch for no reason. It is the will of the state and the culture of the whole state and the whole culture of the whole society and the culture of those people that makes monarchs so important in those countries. And when it comes to traditions, should he resign, people would be even more enraged and would pressurize even more that person. So not only would he come down to their level and to live like them, they would pressure him even more, because he would now be the reason why then they don't have their traditional value and traditional figure of a monarch anymore, and they would pressure him even more because he resigned and he was trained for all his life. For all the reasons that we have brought you, because we have shown you the perspective of a society and the perspective of an individual that is monarch, please oppose this motion. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for that speech and invite forward Kyle to continue the case on behalf of the government.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we believe, and I think it's very clear worldwide, we've been seeing a further push to democracy. And we believe that that push to democracy is necessary in the recognition of the will of the people. Now we believe that we shouldn't have even symbolic barriers in the face of this push to democracy, and that's the kind of barrier that we think that the monarchy provides. With that, I'll be going into 2 points of refutation. First of all, just clearing up something that the opposition seems to have misunderstood. And secondly, dealing with the issue of tradition. And then finally, I'll be going into my 3 points of positive matter. Dealing first of all with their question that they raised about what is actually in the monarch's best interest. But second, talking about what actually promotes equality and the message sent to the rest of the world, which is largely neglected by said opposition. First point of refutation, and I think this can be cleared up rather quickly. We're not actually claiming, and never have claimed, that Europe is under some sort of despotic, tyrannic rule. That's false, and frankly, kind of absurd. So we were never claiming that, and I hope the opposition can understand that now. We are saying that the problem is that a lot of the pieces where there are legitimately despotic leaders do model themselves after monarchs, and there's this fundamental philosophical inconsistency that exists when you have a democratic government with a holdover from a regime that believed that men are not, in fact, all created equal. But we're not under any circumstances claiming that the Queen of England is some sort of tyrant. Moving down to my second point of refutation, that sometimes tradition does in fact need to be abandoned. And we can talk about just like one of the most basic conditions for this, that we need to abandon this tradition and this symbol when that symbol runs contrary to the entire philosophical foundation of the nation that exists right now. We would never say that Rome should still be underneath a Caesar, even though that's within the tradition of Rome. Most Americans would, I think all Americans, would say that America should not be under the rule of a monarch, even though we come from a monarchic tradition coming from England. At a certain point, tradition ought to be abandoned, and we think that that is very clear. We think it is especially clear when you look at how many of these European monarchies conduct themselves. Take, for example, England and other parts of Europe with monarchies intervening, say, in Iraq. Now, they would never, under any circumstances, of course, with the United States, but they would never, under any circumstances, say that Iraq should, in fact, have a monarchy. They would oppose that because it's fundamentally ridiculous and it's antithetical to the philosophical foundations of equality of all men that in fact goes with the traditions of democracy. So we don't believe that this tradition in fact serves a very great purpose right now. But the important thing though is that we can maintain tradition and a connection to the past even without having this symbol be manifested in a person. We can maintain this tradition with the monarchy through history and through the lessons taught to, for example, the children in the United Kingdom or in other countries, for example, in Scandinavian countries that have monarchs. We don't have to have it actually manifested in a person, and we believe that manifesting this tradition in an individual is highly problematic because it institutionalizes within the government a tradition that runs very much contrary to the ideas of equality and representative government that exists now. With that, let's move down into the points of positive matter. First of all, dealing a little bit with this point, how it's in the monarch's best interest. Now, we'd agree that at a certain point, the monarch, if they want to maintain significant power, could stay in the monarchy, but we don't think that's in the country's best interest. But we think that in many circumstances, it would in fact be in the monarch's best interest to step down. For example, stepping down to allow the monarch far more flexibility to serve the country in other ways outside the monarchy. With the scrutiny that's on the monarch, they have less flexibility, for example, to operate within the armed forces in other capacities than they would in the monarchy, because putting their lives at risk is something that's somewhat frowned upon in modern society with the idea of a monarchy. Or if they just wanted to live a normal life, aside from the scrutiny of government, we believe that they could do that as well. Even things such as privacy. There's less public scrutiny without a monarchy, and I'll explain why in a minute, though they seem to think that there would be more. For example, you wouldn't have the whole issue of paparazzi nearly as much if a person is not maintaining in the throne because there's simply less public scrutiny. They don't have to conduct themselves as a monarch because they are no longer a monarch. There would still be some amount of pressure that would continue because of the heritage that comes along with them, but we believe that the flexibility would be significantly higher. But importantly, though, it's in the monarch's best interest because it removes them from a symbolic position, but still maintains a certain amount of influence that comes along with them because they came in this government. That gives them influence within the political and social spheres that they can exercise more freely because they're not constrained necessarily by the monarchy. They're now more freely able to represent positions they support, even without the constraints of the monarchy. Your question?
Do you agree that the Englishman actually likes the idea of having a queen?
Perhaps, but I think that's perhaps irrelevant. They come from the tradition of having the queen, and that's why they like it. If Americans were to have a monarch, they wouldn't, because that's the tradition they have. But we think that the tradition that goes along with this is problematic because this tradition is fundamentally antithetical to the governing position that we have now. Let's move down to the second point, that of promoting equality. Now, Alan already talked about, and I think it's very clear, that the monarchy is a holdover from an era that believed in a very different issue of social standing, believing in the idea that some people are naturally superior to the rest of humanity, with the monarchs and the aristocracy. that there were different rules for the aristocracy that were set apart for a particular special privilege. In fact, even we can see this happening in the last 2 decades, where it's extraordinarily remarkable when a person of ordinary stature can rise into a high position in the monarchy. Take Princess Diana, who was loved in a large part because she rose into the monarchy from a fairly common background, which indicated to as a symbol to the rest of the nation that she, in fact, that there was some sort of mobility. But nonetheless, that was recognized as something remarkable, something that was out of the ordinary, and something that most people couldn't aspire to. But let's talk about how the world, and most people see the world now, with my second point, that people increasingly are demanding equality. Privilege and opulence are opposed. Whenever it looks like someone is in a position that they inherited from their parents, that they didn't do any work to get themselves, but have this ability to exercise power within the government, that's strongly opposed. You can look at that within, for example, the protests by Occupy Wall Street against the 1% in America, where the Wall Street bankers were perceived to get this position of power as an inherited position, that they were therefore able to exercise disproportionate power across the world without any sort of actual representation to democracy. But having the monarch step down creates a greater visible equality and eliminates the greatest sign of hierarchical power that we have in the Western world with democracy. We think this is philosophically necessary on a number of levels because it recognizes truly the will and authority of the people rather than holding over a symbolic gesture toward an era that had fundamentally different values and fundamentally different social thought than we do now. And the fundamental inconsistency exists across the rest of the world when we say that monarchy is something that most other nations shouldn't have, but when European nations still continue to have them. And this is important, my last point, that of the message to the rest of the world which is really never addressed. That it's fundamentally inconsistent for many of these nations to say to the rest of the world, you need to have democracies and need to have everyone be able to have pure social and political mobility within your country, but to still maintain this vestige of a world where people didn't have that and couldn't have that, and where people still recognize that political elevation into the monarchy is something that most people simply cannot aspire to. Which is why we believe it's absolutely necessary that if we were in fact an heir to the throne of any of Europe's monarchies, we absolutely should step down, because the will of the people is the world of the 21st century, and the world that these countries need to awaken to. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for that speech and invite forward Elisabetta to continue the case on behalf of the opposition.
Okay, the Gulf side wants to improve our democracy and cares for the will of the people and cares what is in people's best interest. We will show you why this is in people's best interest and why this is in monarch's best interest. Firstly, a few points on a rebuttal on democracy. Well, the meanings of democracy is not just having elections, but getting people a right to choose, getting people to say what they want. And what the government side is doing is quite opposite of the democracy, because the government side is telling right now through this proposal what is the best from the people. And this is the point when we come to the difference of the Europe and other countries that we say that should not have a monarchy, but Europe must. In Europe, monarchy is okay, but in the other countries such as Iraq, it isn't. Why so? Because in Europe, we reached the democracy. We reached the point when people can say freely whether or not they want to stay democratic, parliamentary monarchy, or whether or not they would rather have a president. And therefore, if they are concerned what is the people's best interest, therefore we believe that it is on people to vote on a referendum or whatever to choose whether or not they will stay monarchy. And it is not on the monarch side to decline his powers. And therefore, we believe that they are debating the different motion here. Second thing is, which comes to the point of Iraq. Well, it is not hypocritical from the UK or for the Holland to say that Iraq should, or the other Eastern countries should not have the monarchy, because that countries didn't reach that level of democracy, and the monarchy in them will certainly mean the oppression of people and would mean the tyranny, the fact that both sides are against on. And second thing we want to talk about is the influence this monarch has. When they say that if that is a good monarch, he can influence his people better, he can do better things by resigning his powers. We say that is not true, because what he does best is being a diplomat. reigning his country in this kind of manner because he's trained for it. You cannot just resign and gain special powers, special abilities in one day and represent your country better. Because if you're trained for something for your whole life, therefore we believe he will influence his people best, and he will lead in amount of his powers he have his country best by staying in the monarchy. Which brings us to our first constructive point, the identity of the nation and the influence on a monarch in a society. Firstly, the identity of European nations is based on a monarchy. We reached the level that the equality is the problem, because now people are guaranteed all the rights. But the thing is that when we're talking about monarchy, they felt the monarch part of their culture, and by resigning, monarch will deprive them right of their culture. We see cultures can change and cultures can evolve, but we say that we have the amount of conscience to see whether or not our culture should change or not, and we believe that the government side is not the one to oppress their opinion on us, and therefore we believe in monarch. In such countries where the support for the monarchy is high and is an important part of the tradition and the culture of such things, would inflict much higher harm towards the society than to stay on the power, because all the harms that the government side is proposing are impossible in European countries. Yes?
If I'm in love with someone who might not fit the typical monarch stance, how will I ever be able to be happily with them in modern society as a monarch?
Firstly, that is not the blind love. People are very well aware that some monarchs can do bad, and therefore we got them limited amount of powers, and therefore, as I previously talked in my speech, not to repeat myself, we have the means to remove the ones who inflict us the harms. But what we want to further develop is why monarch from his personal perspective, because we are now speaking from the perspective of the person who is heir to the throne, and why we, as such person, when we are waging benefits and harms, should not resign and should not resign the throne. We already say if we do care from the society. We already explained to you that by staying on the throne, we are doing a good thing for the society. Second thing is our personal thing as an heir to the throne. But when we are the ones who will make such decisions. But we are not making such decisions just for ourselves. As we are affecting the whole society as such, we are also affecting the family as such matter. And therefore, we are affecting people that we love and that we take care, and we are changing their lifestyle as well. And we are they also have certain powers and certain standard in state. And therefore, we believe that we are depriving much higher circle of people, and we are we are harming the people we love. And when we reach such conflict, we can harm ourselves on emotional level. We can harm ourselves. We can harm also the ones we love, and we can harm the society as such. And therefore, we believe that when we are waging benefits and costs of going to the throne or not, we believe we should do it, and that we should choose to be the monarch as such. And therefore, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
I would like to thank you for that speech, and I would like to invite forward Rebecca to open the case for the second half of the government.
The framework you're going to get from Second Gov today is twofold. First off, do we think you as a monarch or becoming a monarch will make you personally happy? And then the second question is, even if you possibly are personally happy, like let's say you are okay with possibly getting scrutinized by the media on an everyday basis, does your personal happiness outweigh the values your people want to create for themselves as you being the one icon that represents them internationally? Like, could you conceivably be happy with this power versus like controlling your people in some aspect? We think we've gotten a very interesting top half debate, and what we want to discuss in particular in my extension is like, what does a reasonable heir want, like personally, and then second, what creates this culture and what will affect this culture, because we think we highly agree with what's come out in the fact that we are talking about a monarch like in the UK or possibly like in the Netherlands, where they don't really have control of parliament, but they are on the money and they are the people who are in the media. Like, we think that's the type of people we're talking about. So here's some rebuttal first off. So we get from first opposition's very first speaker is this idea that if you resign, it's going to be really bad because people are going to look down poorly on you. I think the one example I can look at today is like Prince Albert and how he was madly in love with a woman who no one in society accepted because she was like a divorced American, and we hate divorced Americans in the UK, I guess. And because he resigned, he was actually much happier, because if he did not only be king, but be king and be sad, like he wouldn't have been a good leader because he wasn't the type of person who could stand up and give, I mean, I've seen the King's Speech, couldn't really stand up and give the type of a rousing speech that people wanted because he wasn't happy in his position, but he also wasn't happy in his personal life. And we see he was able to leave and kind of lead like a quiet life in the countryside and still be like financially stable. So we think that in this, the real distinction is whether or not you take this power, you take control, or you kind of go live off in the back country, maybe in your own little private mansion or something. So now what we get from the second speaker is this real idea that you're going to lose a lot of tradition. Now I think we can point to the Austrians and in fact look at the video. They once had a very strong monarchy that was no longer in power really. And we think that they still value the type of culture that the Austrian royalty gave them. Like they still have buildings and they still have beautiful monuments to these people, like, or in Hungary, like we were just in Budapest, they have rows of what their emperors were and what their empresses looked like, but they don't have to have those people still in power to kind of gain value and gain assertion that they had some good past. Now the last bit we get is kind of this idea that you want your family, like this is affecting your family, and we highly agree. Maybe your mom, the queen, might be a little sad that you decide to abdicate the throne, but we think that first off the value of your happiness is better, but then also your children, because we suspect that these people will probably have children or might consider having children, and those people will also be entering the system where they're not consenting. So here's my extension. What does a reasonable heir care about? And we have 4 different things: family, love, self-esteem, and safety. So what do we think with family? And I preview it for you. We think their children are probably something they're going to care about, or like possibly their brothers and sisters. Like in some way you are, like let's say you are like Prince Charles and Prince William. Like if you're the one who's next in line and you say, I abdicate, and then you give your brother the ability to say, I also abdicate, you are helping him out if he doesn't want to be in that scenario. Now why is that so important? Like why would that make you happy if you're able to separate your children out of this system? Because you're never forcing your children to be unconsenting to a position of power. Because we think, well, it is difficult to make this decision. It's very hard if your mother and your father made a decision when they could, or like made the decision to be a leader when you did not. That it may look bad on you self-esteem wise, but we think that you're actually making the best decision for your children. Now the next point is love. I'll take it in a minute. The next point is love. We see in particular, like look at what's happening with like Kate and William, for example. They're constantly under scrutiny of like, is their relationship happy? Is their relationship going well? Is she pregnant? Is she having twins? And we think that in particular, if you're a person who might be, I don't know, gay, might actually be interested in someone who isn't as beautiful as Kate Middleton, you're probably going to get a lot of like crap about it. Like you're not going to be someone where your self-esteem is happy. You're not going to feel comfortable loving someone when everyone else tells you they're wrong, like in the case of Prince Albert. Go ahead.
Okay, but the situation could easily be vice versa. You can inflict your children your own choices instead of encouraging them to make their own.
Okay, so you're saying that you can encourage your children to make their own choices once you've taken the throne. Okay, we don't think that that's necessarily like, the queen can encourage her children to do it, but we also think it's better if you just do it yourself and it's easier for them that way. Okay. So, and we think, for example, like, if you're talking about someone who's always under media scrutiny, because these people represent their country, represent all the people in that country, that if you're not following like a certain relationship, like heterosexual normative, or like even like a type of person, like a beautiful person, you're never going to be happy because you're always going to be told that you could do better, basically. Now the next bit is self-esteem. Now we think that the aspect of you're never actually able to form an identity, you're always prince something, or you're always king something if you enter into this monarchy. You're never able actually to be like, I don't know, Albert, until you don't decide that you don't want to be King Albert anymore. We think that with that sense, you can't have the type of friends that you can in normal life. You're always questioning, do these people like me for me, or do they like me because I have power? Do they like me because I have this special position and can take them to receptions, or do they like me for who I am? And we think that's valuable for people. Now the last point is safety. In particular, let's look at the safety aspect of people like the Queen. The Queen is constantly under attack, basically. She can't even travel in the subway, or like the underground. She can't even travel in these types of locations because she's the person that people like terrorists or people who are against the government initially go to attack because she's so valuable. And we think that when you're a person who is constantly afraid of how valuable you are, you're not going to be able to feel safe. Now the next, so we don't think it makes you personally happy for all of those reasons, talking about my first framework. Now let's say you don't believe any of that. Why do we think that, even if that's true, why culture is created by these people, and why you have to value the culture created by your people over like your symbolic culture, basically? Because we think that culture is created by things like arts and interpretation of history, kind of what we get from First Gov, but then also like leaders, like the people that are in charge and represent that country. And we think that can be created in two reasons. It can be things like elected officials, it can be things like movie actresses, or like popular arts people. And we think that those two types of people are things that represent the people. Like you elect an official, or everyone goes to a movie and that movie becomes really popular. So we think that there's a type of consent within that culture creation that means that people are actually representing themselves with the type of culture they like. I may not love Hangover 3, but most Americans do love Hangover 3, so it's probably a good representation. But the Queen may not necessarily be the best person. So when it comes down to it, we think that you need to decide whether or not you're personally going to be happy. We don't think you are. And if you're ever going to have your country be happy because of this decision. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for that speech and invite Lord Orry to continue the case on behalf of the opposition.
Oli. It's Oli. If you expect to know how to say my name and you don't know it?
It's your Orry, it's Orry. But Obi, I can try and do better. The accent on the E.
Let's go. There's a personal responsibility to our monarch, Denik. He is responsible for his country's tradition that differentiates his people in a large and unified evolving European state. I will touch this in a moment. And he is responsible for stability in a country where he is the only ruler. In a moment. Personal responsibility that comes out of his position is as a public figure that has responsibility beyond his happiness, and we will touch that in a second. So I'm going to talk to you about two scenarios to address this debate. The first scenario, and the more common one, is the scenario that mostly talked about in this debate, the scenario when the monarch has some democratic state, like in England or in the Netherlands, and because the first government wanted to talk about the second scenario, we'll talk a little bit about the second scenario when he is the only ruler and no democratic figures and stuff like that. A short rebuttal. They talked mostly about the monarch's happiness through family, love, self-esteem, and safety. Now, first of all, he is a public figure. As being a public figure, happiness isn't the only factor for him, but even if we should now speak about his happiness, we say that totally ignoring the fact that he was raised as a public figure is problematic. He was raised for this destination. He was raised to fulfill himself through being this monarch. Now, we say that not fulfilling your destination that you were raised in is surely something that hurts your happiness, like a law student student becoming a good lawyer times 1 billion maybe in this case. Now, fulfillment is happiness. Not fulfilling his destination is very likely to bring him to unhappiness. And now the second thing, the value of culture of the people, I will address that through my first point that I will get in right now. The personal responsibility of the monarch. Two scenarios. The liberal democracy where a monarch is a symbol which we see in most cases. We shouldn't... why shouldn't the monarch give upon his throne? This is what we're going to answer right now. His personal responsibility to the tradition of the country. At this case, we don't need to answer the question of democratic values. They exist, England, Spain, in this scenario. Now, what should we ask ourselves today? The first question, what is the importance of tradition to the people of the country in Europe today? This will be our extension. The second question, why is monarchy important for tradition? First, I've started to talk about it. We will deepen inside. First question, the importance of tradition in Europe today. A tradition is something that differentiates and characterizes countries. The example is my own example, our Jewish tradition in Israel, etc., etc. But more importantly, is it so important to our case? Why is it so important to our case in Europe? Not now. Differentiating countries from one another. This is the importance in Europe today. Countries in Europe today are becoming closer and more alike, politically, economically wise, etc. EU, the EU and its implications. The example of the power of the EU authorities, the free trade that brings products that once symbolized the country to any place in Europe today, etc. Now, what differentiates countries still today? Tradition. There are parts of tradition that stay today, of course. They are important to the people that need to differentiate themselves from other countries in more coming closer together, Europe today. First half.
But we've seen, as we argued, that these traditions can be maintained even without having an individual having to represent them.
Come again?
These traditions may be maintained very clearly in these countries, even if we don't have an individual necessarily representing these traditions.
Look, these traditions can remain in buildings, like they say, maybe in manufacturers, but we say that in Europe today, because we need this kind of differentiating, that only a monarch will be as huge symbolized as we want and as big differentiating as we want to get. Of course, there will be a little differentiating, but it won't be like really having that kind of the Queen of England, which symbolizes so much and so much obsession to the British people. Don't ask me why, no idea. Second question that we need to answer here is, of course, the question that why is monarchy important for tradition? It was, we actually don't need to give it so much time because it was answered throughout the room. And everybody agreed upon it. The monarchy is a tradition. We claim that it is a large part of it. The example is, of course, the obsession of the British people that I just talked about to their queen and to all that she represents. People in England or even Spain see the monarchy as something that defines them, and most importantly in Europe, differentiate them from the other European countries. In the bottom line, the heir should take the throne because other the benefits of the position that obviously he has the benefits of being enthroned, he is keeping the definition and differentiation of his country through and of his people through this tradition. This tradition belongs to all the citizens of his country, and this is something that he needs to take care of and to keep it. Now, to our second scenario, not now. To our second scenario, and basically probably most important because it is less common in Europe, but we will address it as well. The monarch in a country that doesn't have a democratic regime. Why shouldn't he step down? Other than losing its power and all the good things that comes with a throne, of course, throne is fun, let's face it. Not now. Now, for the benefit of the people and stability, he should take the throne for stability and the benefit of the people. I will explain it exactly now. Historically, in monarchies that gave control to a democratic regime in a slow process and didn't go down in Europe, we saw that it was a healthier and a more stable process. We can see that, of course, in the Netherlands. We can see this, of course, in England. When the monarchy stayed as a symbol and didn't give up the throne, we see now today very good and stable democratic regimes without the option of a coup. What is the other options that we should address today? The option that you're saying that the government bench is offering us. They are offering, their scenario is when there was a harsh and quick change. We see the option of, let's say, the bloody French Revolution, or worse than that, like we see today in Assad, Syria, where the monarch is going down at once, and we see a bloody revolution, and we see the option of less stability, which is of course less good, and more people dead, which is of course less good. In the bottom line, even in this extreme case, he shouldn't step down. Now, we talked to you about two scenarios today. The first scenario is the more common scenario, and the second scenario is the scenario of the monarch without the democratic regimes. And in both places, we showed you how the monarch should not consider even giving up his throne. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you for that speech and invite forward Serena to close the case on behalf of the government.
What we see on our side of the house is how you should judge this debate is looking at the monarch and the choices that they have to make about whether or not they want to perpetuate an institution that has been in their country for perhaps thousands of years, and whether or not it's going to be a good thing both for them but for their country. And we see that these are the two aspects that this individual must weigh when making this decision. And so what I'm going to do for you today is I'm first going to talk about the effects on the individual and what that means by perpetuating this institution. And secondly, I'm going to talk about the effects on your country when you're buying into this sort of tradition, which on their side they classify as good and that the people have opted into. So what I'm first going to do, though, is I'm going to go through some brief rebuttal of the speech that we heard before me. He gave us these two different scenarios of the ones where most often happen in Europe, which are the ones, or as far as I know, they're like all in Europe, where you have this democracy and then you have this monarch figurehead. So we're really unclear why they presented us with this like other odd rationale about how sometimes there's one monarch who's actually in control of things, because it's pretty clear that this debate is about a monarch figurehead who doesn't actually have any control except for the cultural aspect. So I don't believe that really pertains. But as to the sort of traditions he's talking about this what actually happens in Europe, he talks about how this tradition belongs to all the citizens, and it's the responsibility of the monarch to take care of this tradition and perpetuate it. However, he fails to engage with what Becca mentioned in the second half of her speech, which really answered this point, which is that he's perpetuating, or her, if it's queen, is perpetuating this tradition which the people are not actually able to buy into. There is no feedback to the monarchy about whether or not the traditions that they're actually perpetuating are actually valid or represent these individuals. Unlike an elected position, such as prime minister, I guess prime minister is elected indirectly through parliament, but such as parliament, or such as the president, who you elect and you say that you are who I want to actually represent me, you're who I like as creating my culture. Whereas instead, you have this sort of still traditions which are put on this monarch, in which the monarch then has this responsibility to perpetuate, even though there's no check on the sorts of traditions that they're actually perpetuating. Furthermore, he talks about how this tradition differentiates countries, yet he never tells us why we exactly need a monarchy to actually give this differentiation between different cultures. And we've really shown you how you can do that through things like museums and statues and stories. We think that these are much better and don't come with the harms of a monarchy. So, first off, what are the effects on the individual? Because we hear on the opposition side that what's really going to happen is they're going to be disappointing their family, they're going to be disappointing the people, and it's really going to hurt them because they're not making this choice, and they're not carrying their responsibility. However, what we see is that by affirming a monarchy, they're saying that they want this to continue. By accepting this position, they're affirming this institution. And what does this institutional actually mean on an individual level? Because I think this is what they failed to recognize in Becca's speech of what she was saying. But it's perpetuating robbing individuals of their consent and their autonomy. These are the sorts of examples in which she gave you on this idea of how, through identity, you're identified as queen or king, not as like Sir, or not as like Albert. It's what we saw in the movie when the empress was being referred to by her husband just as empress, and she was like, "Why don't you ever look at me as the mother of your children? Why am I not Sisi? Why am I just always the empress of Austria?" We think that by consenting, by accepting this position, you're accepting that you're going to be willingly giving
giving up this autonomy of yourself and of your children and perpetuating the system which lacks consent and autonomy and making the choice for you by this tradition being forced on you. It's giving up your right to choose jobs, your identity, the people you love, your safety because you're going to be putting yourself at risk. And we think at the point at which you're only acting as a figurehead within your society that it's really important what the personal effects are going to be on you as a person. And that's why you really have to weigh this point and why this point is actually quite valid in this debate. Because you as an heir to a monarchy have to think about not only your people, but also you as a person and the effects it will have not only on you, but on your children and on future generations to come. Because this lack of consent and autonomy will continue to happen if you keep accepting this position. Before I go on to the second point, I'll take you.
Do you think that a public figure like a monarch has no personal responsibility to the people he rules?
I think that they have responsibility to act, but I don't think that this responsibility should exist, which is what I'm going to get in my second point, which is the effects on your country. Because what else does this institution mean, aside from what it means for the individual and their offspring and future generations? Well, it means that you're perpetuating buying into an inaccessible culture of this elitism, which is what Becca also taught you. She told you about how monarchs are not like elected representatives. They're not like cultural figures who we affirm by watching their movies or talking about, or rapidly reading magazines if you're a celebrity. And we think that these individuals, these elected representatives, whether it is by majority through votes or through cultural references, is a much better representative of the current culture and the current traditions that a country actually values. We think that that right now what's happening is these countries are being forced to accept this default option of their monarch because it's being perpetuated as something that's good, and it's forcing this tradition on the people to accept it, and it may not entirely actually be accurate. And we think that, yes, tradition is important, but we think that this is perhaps standing in the way, and they never said why the monarchy is so necessary to this tradition other than that people like it. But there's really no way for people to actually say that they like it. And we think that that's really problematic. And if we're looking at the effects on your country, then that's something that you need to take into consideration, is not just this supposed responsibility, but what you're actually doing to the culture as being placed in this position, and whether or not you even should have this responsibility, which is rather arbitrary and you were just born into by happenstance. So we think that it's both bad for you and also bad for your country in this way. And we also agree that it's really going to be a contradiction in the symbolism, which they also present as a good thing. They say it's good to have this symbolic leader because of this tradition, but it also leads to sorts of contradictions, which we heard from the top half of this debate, to developing dictators who see themselves as legitimate because they look to countries like the European Union, or not, European Union isn't a country, but they look to countries within the European Union for the sorts of guidance and affirmation of what they're doing. So by legitimizing this institution and perpetuating this idea that you can perpetuate yourself and your children into this elitist culture, and this culture that's inaccessible to other people, you're affirming this culture, and you're saying that it's okay for not only it to happen in your country, but to happen in other countries, because you see it as a legitimate way for a country to function. And in that sense, you are responsible for those actions that we see that's happening in these developing dictators and the sorts of statements you're sending to other countries. So because we think it would be really bad for you as an individual, and also really bad for you as a country, well, for you on behalf of your country, to accept this, we think that you should not take the throne.
Here, here. I would like to thank you for that speech and invite forward or to close the debate for the opposition and the debate as a whole.
Can I start? And just a second. Just a second. Oh, okay. So Spider-Man would really like to quit his job and doing whatever he wants. He really wants to go and marry Mary Jane. The thing that he doesn't do that is because the people of New York is trusting him to do his job. He wanted to go and have love with the other person, so to do so on and so forth, but he can't do it because the people is trusting him. Now the question is this: does the heir, the monarch, have any kind of accountability for the people? I will show you in my first about what should be the monarch interest, that he does have some accountability for the people and he cannot be quit because he is accountable from them in some matter. And the second point I'm going to show you, the second question we should ask is for what is actually accountable of. We all agreed that he doesn't really have a power in his country, but it's only a symbolic power. And I will show you in my second class about the role of the monarch in the country's tradition and why this tradition is actually important for the people. Just to make clear, yes, we are speaking about the countries where there are monarchs and democracies. The only reason that Ori brought up the other option is because it's actually we've been talking about the room, but we don't mind to deal only about those kind of countries. Before I'm going to speak about my points, I want to have some rebuts. No, thank you. I just want to add more positive to the question to the POIs asked by first. Is about tradition can survive without the monarch. Now, not necessarily. We don't know when and if the tradition will really won't fade away during the years. And secondly, as they already agreed, also democracies can coexist with a monarchy, just like happens today in Netherlands and democracy. So if they can live and it's not an issue, we don't see what the problem is. Second point about the people don't vote for the monarch, so they don't vote for the tradition that he represents. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is tradition. You don't vote for it. You don't choose it. You just lived in a country which has a tradition that is history. You can't choose it. You just live it, and that's how the nature of things. Now, the notion that the tradition can actually live through museums, through statues, and so on and so forth, we don't believe that it's really true. Because the thing is that monarchy is the thing that makes you as your tradition as unique than other countries. Now, again, yes, there are museums and there are things like that, and so on and so on. But the thing is, and I will show you. Afterwards, that the tradition today in Europe is being faded away because it's being much more united and the borders are getting a little bit shady. And fourth point about the responsibility shouldn't exist. That's what second props say. They don't believe that the responsibility should exist upon the monarch. But the thing is, I am a monarch, I'm living now, I have the responsibility already. Even if I don't think it should exist, it exists, I have it just like Spider-Man has it, and that is why we need to deal with that. So, to my first point about the interest of the monarch. Now, the monarch is for a succession is a part of a dynasty. What does it mean? In a democratic state, he only represents, that's what they say, they only represents, it's only a symbolic character. And for the other, the democratic things, we have the parliament and etc. So what he does is just representing the tradition of the country. He's the face of the tradition. Now, as a monarch, I know I don't have a power. I know that, I live in a democracy. I think it's okay. That's how I raised. I know that I don't really have the power to change and to become a dictator. I know that as a successor, I have the responsibility, a personal responsibility for the tradition. I know because that's how I've been raised. That's how I've been taught, that I am part of a succession. That the people are looking at me, and because of part of the succession, because it's our race, I have a personal responsibility as a monarch. Now, the only harm that the proposition showed us is it will make me unhappy, but I cannot think only about myself. This is not how I raise. This is not how I've been raised. Because I'm a monarch, I've been part of the succession. I've been told that I am accountable for the rest of the people, and that is why I'm not thinking only about my self-happiness, but the happiness and what the other wants. And that leads me to the second point about the tradition. Before that, I'd say second.
Sure. Why aren't elected cultural representatives preferable to things that are default that we can't keep checks on?
Come again. Sorry.
So why aren't elected cultural representatives superior to unelected, uncheckable ones like a monarch?
Again, when we're talking about tradition, it's not something that we're choosing, it's something that we're liking. When we're being born into a country with a certain tradition, when we're being born into a country which has a monarch, that's a part of the tradition. If this monarch doesn't really causes harm upon us, there's not really a problem, there's not really harm on the eyes of the people, but I'm speaking on my eyes and my accountability. And to my second point about why do we don't need to abandon tradition, why the tradition is important in Europe. Now, the proposition thinks that democracy it's the higher value. We do agree, but we agree with thinking it can coexist with the democracy. As the opposition told us, no, the opposition told us that monarchy can be good for the people. But what we brought you in our section is why exactly the monarchy is good for the people, why exactly the role of the monarch in the tradition part is good for the people. Now, in Europe today, we have the same currency, the borders are almost open. The tradition is slowly fading away because of the modernity. Now, we believe that in some part, that's not a choice of the people, because it's the governments that are opening the borders. The government are making Europe more united. And it may be good, but the tradition is fading away. And we know that people like the tradition because, firstly, the Englishmen really like the Queen, because they're still going to museums, just like I say, they're still celebrating the national holidays, etc., etc. People like tradition. We do want to reserve the tradition. The governments, because of their action, some of the tradition is fading away. Now, because of the tradition fading away, and because we do actually like the tradition, we still have the monarch. Now, now the monarch is one of the biggest reminders for us about our legacy, about tradition, because not everyone is going to museums, even though they're celebrating the holidays. But if I have a monarch, I always have the constant notion that, hey, this is what tradition, I know that, I live by it, I live through it. And because that people actually needs and wants the tradition, and because the main part of the tradition is the monarch, because the monarch has his accountability and responsibility for the people, the bottom line is, as a personal responsibility, the monarch cannot whatever. Thank you. You stop writing.